just black and white, and I think it's really important to recognize that these processes are complex and they're contradictory in certain respects. For instance, they're contradictory when you recognize the extent to which we as racialized people who, although colonial subjects are, when we are in Canada, are implicated in the process and order of colonization. Because what is our relationship to Aboriginal people? Our relationship to Aboriginal people is determined, is mediated through the colonial order. We understand, we come to understand Aboriginal people through what white people say about Aboriginal people. We come to relate to Aboriginal people through how white Canada relates to Aboriginal people. And so one of the things that I and other people have been saying over the last little while is we need to establish a horizontal relationship between racialized populations and Aboriginal people, and start to talk about our implicatedness in that process of colonization, but also our common experience of oppression and the possibility of us establishing a basis for solidarity. I think that that is really critical. I think that that really ought to be the political agenda of the moment. Right? I'm getting well past this idea that race is not is no longer important in Canadian history. I think it's also important to recognize that in Canadian society, the complexity also extends to the possibility that on the one hand we have a society that subscribes to anti-racist values, whereas on the other hand it also maintains racialized norms in processes of decision making, whether that is in government or in business or in the academy or in the way that adult society deals with our young people, especially in the education system, but even outside of the education system. Charles will probably talk about the prison industrial complex. Right? I think it's really important to do that. And part of how that happens and is sustained is that it is veiled through such concepts as Canadian experience. It sounds neutral and non-threatening. But what exactly does Canadian experience mean, and what does the demand for Canadian experience imply, and what are the implications and the outcomes of the demand for Canadian experience? I once talked about a software engineer from India who is in India producing a bunch of software products that are consumed by Canadian companies. And the issue of whether the quality of those products is not sufficient does not arise. But when that individual comes to Canada and seeks to do exactly the same thing, produce exactly the same product, then they are told that there's an issue of the quality of their human capital. Or they're told that it is in the public interest that they not be allowed to do exactly what they were doing in a different context, although we are in a globalized economy. Right? They are veiled in this notion of soft skills. Or, you know what I'm talking about with soft skills, right? Yes. Can that black woman get along with the team? And if she can't get along with the team, or if the team rejects her, she cannot get along with the team. If the team rejects her, she does not have the necessary soft skills to be successful. And so we exclude her. We do not interrogate the team and its attitude towards her. We exclude her. She doesn't have the necessary soft skills. All these narratives of a heroic Canadian role in the Underground Railroad, you've all heard about those. Not to mention our participation in peacekeeping in the Congo, in Haiti, in East Timor, in Cyprus, all of which are meant to create a certain narrative about Canadian commitments to an anti-racist and liberal democratic society. Right? Okay. So what we are confronted with then is a denial of racism that is manifested through the very idea that Canada is a post-racial or colorblind society. This resonates because it is at once related to multiculturalism, and on the other hand, it sort of fits with this notion of liberal democratic ideals that define Canada. So I want to suggest really strongly that it is essential for Canada to reject this allure of color blindness and to remain committed to the recognition of difference as a central organizing principle in Canadian society. And not just Canadian society, but most modern societies. I think that that is the path that we need to take towards establishing an inclusive future. There are three ways that I think it's important for us to interrogate the issue of race and the extent to which race matters in Canadian society. The first, of course, is a recognition that Canada is a racially diverse society. We've heard a lot about that over the last week. The second is the state institutions, through the Constitution and the courts, and the extent to which they affirm the existence of race as an important organizing principle. The third is the recognition of the lived experience of racialized people, which we can interrogate by looking at the socioeconomic status and the various indicators that make up the socioeconomic status of racialized people. So I want to suggest that, and I will not be able to go through all of this, but I just want to suggest that it is important that not only do we make the argument that the idea that race matters, or more so that it is central to understanding the Canadian project and the reality of racialized people in Canada, that we not let go of that notion. But also that we recognize that it is not sufficient for us to simply make the case. We can make the case, we can make the argument. What we need to do beyond making the case and making the argument is we need to pursue very aggressively political power. I think it is critical that we move into a realm where we exercise our agency to define the Canadian project, our agency to define the Canadian reality, and to insist that our reality is part of the definition. Is part of the definition of the Canadian reality. The truth of the matter is, as we move into a future where the racialized population is going to be about a third of the Canadian population, 1 in every 3, as we move into that future, we have a lot of unfinished business, both as racialized people who need to assume responsibility for our agency, but also as Canadian society, which needs to create and redefine and reconsider the socio-institutional arrangements that to this point have been responsible for the social exclusion of racialized people. We cannot simply walk into the tent as is. Because if we walk into that tent, if we're invited into that tent, we will move from the outside to the inside, but still populate the outer edges of that tent. I insist that we consider striking the tent. Striking the tent and starting all over again. I did not go into the reality of multiculturalism, which I think is an important opportunity. On the one hand, it masks the experience of racialization, but on the other hand, it opens the door because it establishes a level of recognition for difference that we can exploit. We can exploit that. I think we have to be a lot more nuanced in the way that we challenge Canadian society. I think it's important for us to say, well, you made a commitment to multiculturalism. Our experience of multiculturalism is that it falls far short of the aspiration that you claim. And that, as Martin Luther King said, we are here to ensure that you live up to your own aspirations. And living up to your own aspirations means that you have to create a new form of society, an inclusive society, which we ought to be part of defining.
Yes.
We cannot allow for them to define what an inclusive society is. We certainly cannot allow the Globe and Mail to define what an inclusive society is. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.